You're about to have a new audio experience. Same podcast you love, with a few new audio tweaks. If you're a long-time listener of the podcast, you'll have heard me mention the name Dr. Nicky Falkof before. Dr. Falkof's work often comes up when I research cases which pertain to allegations of occult involvement. She's already written several books, and her latest, The Devil Made Me Do It, is one of the most comprehensive and insightful resources that relate to true crime and the occult intersection I've ever read. I had the distinct pleasure of chatting with Dr. Falkof about some of these cases and the book in general. This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to The Devil Made Me Do It with Dr. Nicky Falkof. True Crime South Africa is an independent podcast and relies on listener support to keep going. There are many ways you can support the podcast. You can check out all of them at truecrimesouthafrica.com. The most impactful way is by joining the Patreon community. Patreon members get free access to TCSA events, exclusive episodes, discounts on my audiobooks, and ad-free episodes. So you don't have to listen to me say this every week. You can join the Patreon community from just $2, around 32 Rand a month. And if you aren't big on commitment, not only is there a free 7-day trial, but you can also cancel at any time. New Patreon supporters get a shout out when they join. Listen through to the end for that. Patreon/True Crime South Africa. Please. And thank you.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information in our show notes.
If you visit Nicky Falkof's website, you're greeted with an incredibly impressive description of her. She is a writer and an academic based in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she holds the SARCHI Chair in Critical Diversity Studies and heads up the Wit Centre for Diversity Studies. She is the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Critical Diversity Studies and sits on the editorial boards of Feminist Media Studies, the International Journal of Cultural Studies, Critical Arts, and the Journal of Gender Studies. She also co-edits the book series governing intimacies in the Global South. Nicky has a PhD in interdisciplinary humanities and cultural studies from the London Consortium, part of Birkbeck College, University of London, and a master's in critical theory from Sussex University. What that description does not tell you, though, is that Nicky is also a pretty cool human. I've had the pleasure of engaging with her several times over the years and always walk away from our conversations feeling like I've learned something, and equally, that I was heard. I knew about her most recent book, The Devil Made Me Do It, before it was publicly announced, because she interviewed me as a source for the book. Wild. I know. How did the girl from Boksburg who worked as a sales manager end up being considered expert enough on a topic to be interviewed by a serious academic and prolific author? Well, it's because I wrote a book about a case that had a particular interest for Nicky. My first book, published in 2022, called Samurai Sword Murder. If you haven't read it, it's about the murder of a young man called Jacques Pretorius, whose life was ended far too soon by a fellow school pupil, Monet Haramsa. There were some claims by the offender and some elements of that case that brought up allegations of occult involvement, and this is one of the cases that Nicky examines in detail in her new book. I think by now, if you've listened to enough of my episodes, you know what I think in general about allegations of occult involvement in criminal cases. While I absolutely respect everyone's rights to their belief systems, in the vast majority of cases I've seen of this nature, the allegations are made in order to distract and attempt to minimize the offender's actions. Usually, the allegations don't make it as far as the courtroom. But when they do, they obviously need to be handled delicately, but also firmly. I will admit that there was at least one case in Nicky's book that made me realize that this general rule of mine will not always apply. And there are very rare instances where an element of how belief systems have impacted a crime do actually need to be considered, especially in an exceptionally diverse country like ours. So that gives you some background to this interview, and I think it's about time I just get into it.
My name is Nicky Falkof. I am a writer and academic. I work at Wits University, where I am currently the director of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies.
When you meet someone who is as accomplished as Dr. Nicky Falkof, it's difficult to imagine what they might have been like as a child or a teenager. And as many academics tend to veer off into niche fields that fascinate them, figuring out where that fascination came from is often an interesting question. In The Devil Made Me Do It, Nicky discusses a bit of her own childhood, and particularly her teenage years, when she was very much the kind of young person who would have gotten significant side-eye by those enmeshed in the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. In other words, she was a normal teenager, a little grungy, a little left of centre. And I wondered what it was like for her as an adult to study and research this era that she'd grown up in, and then realise what was actually going on behind the scenes.
It's so funny that you ask that, because my first academic book, the first book I published in South Africa, is called The End of Whiteness. And half of it is about the Satanism scare in the 1980s. So I've spent a lot of time writing about this. That was based on my PhD. My whole PhD was about Satanism. And every time I talk about that book or this book or any of the other projects I've done about occult beliefs in South Africa, I end up telling the same story of how I was a teenage goth. And it seems to be the entry point for a lot of people that gives them a way into thinking about why this stuff is interesting, because it's not just theoretical. It's not just distanced. So, for me, one of the important points is that as scholars, as writers, as investigators, I think we often end up investigating ourselves. I think we're often drawn to particular issues or topics because they have meaning for us. For me, the question of Satanism and the Satanic panic, and how I was in some ways an observer, but in some ways caught up in it because people thought that I was involved in Satanism because, I wore a lot of black and I really liked the Pixies, the Sisters of Mercy, which was a bit more gothy than the Pixies. For me, those weird memories and those things that I started excavating when I did my PhD actually dragged me back to having to consider my own whiteness, which I was living in the UK at the time. I hadn't thought about what it meant for me to be a white South African for a really long time. And when I started doing these investigations, I realized that these strange cultural pathologies, these conspiracy theories, these bizarre beliefs, these assumptions about people, these ways of demonizing people who were different, that all defined my childhood and adolescence, were actually fundamental parts of what it meant to be a white person at the end of apartheid, and this deep, deep inherent paranoia that was part of white society and white culture that I grew up with, and so many of us grew up with, and that we haven't really had a reckoning with. We haven't really had a reckoning with how white anxiety and white fear really impacts on our society 30 years after the arrival of democracy. So in many ways, it may seem like my interest in Satanism is kind of prurient and a little bit silly, but for me, it really has opened the door to thinking deeply and critically, and in some ways in ways that are quite difficult for me personally, about how white culture and white society continue to have really negative impacts on this country as a whole and on the lives of individual people, both white and not.
Nicky's work wasn't my first foray into satanic panic. I grew up in a lot of it too. My European mother, although she'd been in the country by my teens for decades, had not taken up any form of religion. So I didn't experience that in my home. But I went to school in Boksburg during apartheid. And there was most certainly a level of satanic panic moving through schools there. I remember our music teacher in primary school teaching us about how if you played certain songs backwards, there would be satanic messages hidden in them. Growing up in that, like Nicky did, and also having a very apartheid-constructed education, it was a revelation to me when I started doing this work, and I discovered how satanic panic and religion in general had been weaponized in South Africa by the government at that time. It wasn't just church leaders stirring up things in their communities and parents banning the Smurfs. It's actually fascinating to me how satanic panic manifested differently in different countries, depending on their own culture, economics, and politics. And in South Africa, it was weaponized in an attempt to indoctrinate as much of the white minority population as possible into believing they and the government were in this war between good and evil. And it didn't take very long for that illusion to shift to a claim of a war between black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if you take the satanic panic out of the equation and you look at the history of white Christian nationalism in this country, it's abundantly clear how the state used certain forms of Christianity as a tool of control. And, we like people who know a lot about South African history know about how Christianity was used as a tool for missionaries to control indigenous people and to keep the black population in subjugation. But we think a lot less about how religion has been abused by the state in order to keep control over white people who were ostensibly more powerful. White people were kept in a state of fear. White fear was very, very useful for the apartheid government, and it remains very useful. We're seeing this right now with Donald Trump, with Elon Musk, with the hysteria around the so-called Afrikaner refugees and the white genocide that we all know doesn't exist. But all of this white anxiety is very useful for a certain kind of white supremacist political project. And I think the state was very efficient at manipulating those kinds of Christian beliefs into, as you say, framing apartheid not as a system of legislated racial injustice, but as a great war between good and evil. And that is what so much of the satanic panic achieved. It suggested to white people towards the end of apartheid that we were under threat from a spiritual enemy. And that, we were fighting not just to retain white rule. We were actually fighting for the soul and the very morality, the civilized morality of South Africa as a whole, which gave people like a nice, easy way to go, oh, no, I'm not defending an indefensible system. This is about good and evil. You tell people that something is a fight about good and evil, and suddenly you give them a whole lot of tools to not have to think too carefully about their position in it. And I think in a lot of ways, that's how certain forms of Christianity were very, very effectively manipulated during the Satanism scare towards the end of apartheid.
And when I shared how I've come to realize that matriculating in 1998, I know that I was given a very specifically developed system of education and had to really reteach myself the reality and the true history of our country. That seemed to resonate with Nicky's experience too.
Absolutely. I mean, look, I graduated, I matriculated in 95, so I had the same education that was completely full of holes. And it's taken me, I think this is why I ended up in the career that I ended up in, because I had so many holes that needed filling. And I've spent, since I started doing this work, I've spent so much time trying to fill those holes, but also to look at what those holes have led us to today. And this endemic belief in good and evil that kind of defines so much of South African society, I think really, really plays an important role in how we think about crime today and why ideas about occult crime are still so prevalent. And I mean, one of the arguments that I'm trying to make in this book is, it actually doesn't matter if a crime is quote unquote occult or not. It doesn't matter if the person who murders the child is doing it because they want muti, or because they think Satan ordered them to, or because it's an exorcism gone wrong. Obviously, that matters in helping us understand how this thing happened. But what's important is that a child was murdered. And we over-focus on the supposedly occult element of the crime, because as a nation, we believe that there's some reality to that supernatural element. And of course, it's not my place to say that those things are not real. I do not know. No one can really prove that. And I don't personally have much faith. So I can't say that I believe those kinds of things, but I also can't say that everybody else is wrong. I have no way of proving that for sure. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is that violence is real. And what matters is that these kinds of beliefs can often lead people to violence. So instead of going, was this person really possessed by the devil or not? What we need to be doing is going, why would this person believe that they were possessed by the devil? And why would that belief legitimize such a horrific act of violence? And instead, we're trying to work out whether the possession was legit or not.
Nicky has this way of saying what I'm thinking, just in a really eloquent way, because that's exactly how I feel too. We spend a lot of time arguing about what is real and what is not when it comes to occult crimes. And the truth is, as Nicky says, none of it really matters. It doesn't excuse the crime or help us to get justice for the victims. What it does do is create a distraction, one that detracts from the justice mission and ensures that rather than focusing on the facts of the crime and what the victim has suffered, and sometimes how the system has enabled the perpetrator, we focus on the bright, shiny bits that attract our attention and feed our obsessions.
And I mean, also, that is just human nature. We do sensationalize crime. We do always, as a species, seem to kind of align on the brightest, shiniest, shockingest, most exciting bits of a story. It's not anything that's specific to South Africa. But because we have this history of believing that we are at war with the occult, our collective overinvestment in the occult, as you say, just constantly masks any kind of real evidence-based collective public approach to the problem of violent crime. And we don't have the luxury of doing that in this country. We need to sort this out. I mean, obviously, there's work being done at various levels of the state and civil society to try and combat the scourge of crime. But socially and publicly and in our collective shared imaginary, we're not managing to shift this idea that we're at war with evil, that evil is responsible for evil things. And again, in the book, I quote a philosopher called Hannah Arendt, who I'm sure some of your listeners will be familiar with, who wrote this wonderful book. In the wake of the Nazi Holocaust, she wrote a book about the banality of evil, where she talks about how people who are evil are actually just everyday people who happen to be good at organizing things. And there was a recent film called The Zone of Interest, which really deals with this very well, about Nazis living next door to a death camp and having a fairly normal life. That is where evil comes from. It's not something outside of us. It is part of us. It's human nature. And every time we spectacularize and invent crazy occult threats that come out of nowhere and invent supernatural demons, what we're doing is we're saying, oh, this isn't humans. It's not us doing it. When it is. It's not the devil. It's your uncle or your father or your brother or your school teacher or your mother doing the majority of these really horrific things.
There are many interesting case studies in The Devil Made Me Do It. One of them is Dumi Mbombela's case, which I discussed briefly in the episode about the crimes committed by Elifazi Msomi, when he claimed that Tokolosh had committed his crimes. Dumi's case is very different to Elifazi's, though, and he never tried to claim that he didn't commit the crime. But in the case, it became clear that his beliefs had deeply influenced his actions. And that made me think about something I've heard from several mental health professionals. There's often this gap in culture between the mental health provider and the patient in both criminal and ordinary life therapy and assessments, in which culture and upbringing play an enormous role in how individuals relate to the world. If the mental health provider doesn't understand the patient's culture or has been raised themselves to vilify it, it can have a huge effect on the outcome of the assessment. I wondered what Nicky's thoughts were on this from what she's seen.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. The Dumi Mbela case is so particularly tragic because this person was, he was deeply penalized and punished very, very severely because of his belief in the Tokolosh. But then we fast forward to the 1980s and we get instances where people are, claiming that white people who come from Christian backgrounds are claiming that they were possessed by the devil. And the devil is legible to the legal system in a way that a Tokolosh is not. At least it was during the apartheid legal system. And so those people are treated very differently. They may still be penalized, but there's not this sense that everything you believe is absolutely insane nonsense. It's more like, is it true that it happened in this case? So I think, those differences between how the legal system treats Black African and white European origin or European Christian beliefs is very, very stark. But you also make a very important point that, a lot of this is about mental health professionals. There's an incredibly good and very, very readable, I highly recommend him, Black South African psychologist named Kopano Ratele, who has written a lot of books, a lot of them are about men and about male violence and about why men are violent. And he writes really effectively and really beautifully about the need to create what he calls an African psychology. Because you say we don't throw out the whole thing. We don't throw out all of psychological practice, even though it is deeply, deeply Western in its thinking. I'm an inveterate Freudian. I've read a lot of Freud, but Freud was also completely incapable of thinking outside the world of privileged upper middle class Vienna. So a lot of his stuff just doesn't track when you put it somewhere else. There was a wonderful Jewish, I think Viennese psychoanalyst called Wolf Sachs, who came to South Africa in the early part of the 20th century and attempted to start psychoanalysis in this country by writing about people he actually writes about the Mbombela case, which is why I know him. So people have really tried to get the mental health establishment to open its mind in very different ways. But also, historically, there is this kind of trend of people who are now diagnosed as being neurodiverse or having learning disabilities or having mental health issues, who historically would have been treated as seers or as people with extra wisdom. And it's difficult to say one of those positions is right, one of them is wrong, because of course people who in more tribal cultures are treated as seers often have very miserable lives. They're not necessarily cared for in the way they need to be. But the point is that our mental health establishment needs to be able to incorporate some understanding of people's indigenous cosmologies, of people's worldviews and their beliefs without just going, if you think this is true, you're insane. You cannot be a mental health practitioner in South Africa without understanding that people are called by ancestors. They're called by ancestors to go and twassa. And if your approach to that is going to be, you guys are crazy and uncivilized, you will never be of any use to anyone. So it is, as with the criminal justice system that often can't hold the many contradictions of our incredibly diverse society, the mental health establishment, I think, often fails as well. Some individual practitioners do amazingly, but it often fails in being able to negotiate those multiple contradictions. And it's failing practitioners as much as it's failing patients. Because a lot of people who are called to mental health work are also called to do more traditional spiritual work, but they're being told that those things are often not compatible, when the only reason they're not compatible is because we haven't thought hard enough about how to make them compatible.
That case, Dumi Mbombela, as you'll read in the book, also brings up what is called the reasonable man quandary. And it's another reason I've always thought that having a jury system in South Africa would be a very bad idea. Our country is so diverse that it seems impossible to have a so-called jury of your peers, when all of our lived experiences are so different? I asked Nicky how, in her experience, cultural differences in our country impact legal cases.
I mean, you make an amazing point. I'd actually never really considered the difficulty of finding a jury of one's peers in this country. I know it's difficult in all countries because, even in places that aren't as culturally diverse, you have class differences and differences of gender that really, really impact on how people are read in a courtroom. But then, the flip side of that is so much power is vested in the judiciary. And I think we have an incredible judiciary in this country. I think we're very lucky. I think they're very independent. But that doesn't mean that every single judge is reliable and every single judge is trustworthy. We know that as much as there's corruption in every other national institution in South Africa, corruption creeps into the judiciary as well. So is it necessarily the answer to invest all of this power to make massive decisions about people's lives in one individual or a few small numbers of individuals? I don't know what the answer is. I don't have the knowledge or the creativity to think of a legal system that could work differently. But this is maybe somewhere where, people who are very aware of indigenous knowledge systems and of our histories in this country could be thinking, like, what would it look like to integrate the Western law that we've inherited with the traditional law that, at least officially, we've kind of abandoned? And we have done a little bit of that by, giving a lot of power to tribal authorities, but we've done it in a way that's actually really exploitative. And again, just vests lots and lots of power into individual people, largely men, largely older men who have specific agendas. So that's not really the answer either. And I mean, I'm kind of on a tangent here, but just to get back to your question, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that within the South African legal system, people are massively prejudiced based on their culture and background, based on their capacity to communicate with the court. I mean, I have a very dear friend who recently had to go and get some assistance in a case of domestic violence. And this is a highly educated, highly articulate, extremely functional, professional person who really, really, really struggled to navigate the system just to fill in the correct forms and get the right stuff done. And she came out of this experience so deeply heartbroken about all of these other women who were trying to do the same thing as her, immigrant women, who not only didn't speak English, didn't have, the advantages of middle classness, but didn't even have the advantages of Black South Africanness, who were being failed by the system at every single turn. And when we think about how the South African legal system and the South African medical system, when we think about how these systems let people down, I think the first place we need to go to is to African migrants who deserve justice and decent medical care and basic human rights as much as anyone else, but who are denied them by a system that decides that they treats them as though they are not fully human because they are foreign.
In the book, Nicky refers to the 1980s case in the United States of Michelle Smith, who was initially a patient and then a romantic partner of a psychiatrist called Lawrence Pazder. Pazder used a now discredited method to retrieve what he claimed were deeply buried memories of satanic abuse that Michelle had suffered. Of course, everything is easy to decipher in retrospect, but everything about that relationship strikes me as coercive, with the power slant being very much in Pazder's favor. There's a 20-year age gap. She was his patient. Even the book cover of the book that they wrote gives me this feeling of him overpowering her and everything being about him. It's incredible to me, really, that this had such a huge impact on the rise of satanic panic when it was all really just one man trying to exert his power.
Yeah, I mean, coercive, I think, is an exceptionally good word for that particular relationship. It's such a crazy story because Lawrence Pazder almost single-handedly invented this idea of recovered memory. And the next thing you know, a few years later, not even that long, there are academic conferences about recovered memory. There are court cases. Suddenly, Oprah's going on about it. Everybody believes that recovered memory is a thing. because this guy invented it. And, there's still a lot of talk about this. You go and listen to the whisperings in QAnon circles about, the kind of apparent epidemic of pedophilia among blood drinking elites in pizza wash restaurants in Washington. And they're also talking about things like these kids don't remember it, but then you can get them to recover memories. He just made up a whole field of scholarship that doesn't exist. It's a very, very crazy story. But what it really reminds me of is, I don't know if you're familiar with a guy called Jean-Michel Charcot. My French accent is so terrible. So he was a predecessor of Freud's. And he was a very famous neurologist. And he ran this hospital in Paris, I think at the end of the 19th century, called the Salpêtrière. And it's where all the female hysterics were sent. So if you had hysteria, which basically meant, the men in your life thought you needed to shut up, you were causing too much trouble, they would send you to Charcot to get cured or to get looked after or to get out of the way so that your husband could marry someone younger, or you stopped embarrassing your children, or, you didn't make your dad look like a failure. And what he used to do is he used to exhibit his hysterics. So all these women had these tics and these twitches and these strange physical symptoms. And he would have these, I think, weekly events where all the great men of Paris, the medical men and everybody else, would file in, and they would come, and he'd get his most famous hysterics, and they'd come and do a little display of all their crazy hysteria. And then he would expound on how he was fixing them. And he completely made his fame, created a huge reputation and an enormous amount of fame. And also, I think, was a very good neurologist and did a lot of work. And, it was of its time and didn't necessarily look that exploitative at that moment. But there seems to be this history within the mental health establishment, within psychology, within psychiatry, in which famous men use the bodies of vulnerable women to display their theories and expand their own reputations. And I think Lawrence Pasda is in a direct communion with someone like Charcot. He's possibly a little bit more venal because it's possibly a little bit more intentional. We don't know if he believed that Michelle Smith actually recovered these memories or not. But this is something that seems to happen within psychology, that a woman is brought forward and displayed as an example of some sort of terrible trend, and then a man, often white, generally older, will come and position himself as her savior and be celebrated for the incredible work he's doing to support women.
Nicky mentions in the book how April is claimed to be a month in which Satanists are more active. And in the past, there have been spikes in manufactured panic around that time. And of course, it often coincides with Easter too, which just adds to the religious warfare undertone. And it's slightly ironic that I drafted this question and recorded this interview long before now, but I am in fact releasing it in April, around Easter. But something that struck me when I read that is that April is also known as a month that many mass shootings, especially in schools in the United States, occur. The last 5 or so years, that has started to shift. But the original school shooting, if you will, at Columbine, happened on the 30th of April. And then, for the next decade or so after that, crime experts noticed that this cult-like movement had been created around the Columbine killers, and many copycats or Columbine-inspired killers purposefully committed their crimes in April to align with that anniversary. And what I think is even more interesting is how initially the conversation around the Columbine shooting crime had nothing to do with gun control or mental health, but rather it was focused around the goth elements, with the boys having worn long trench coats and black clothing when they committed the crimes. There was absolutely no evidence that either boy even had an interest in anything occult-related. But the idea that they were taken over by evil was pushed heavily, even by politicians, with one even saying, "These boys didn't need counselors, they needed an exorcism." And when I wrote the book about Mornay Harms's crime, I found that is very much what happened with that case too. Where the actual things that could have been learned from the crime were just lost in this idea that he had been a tool of evil rather than just an incredibly dysfunctional young man.
No, absolutely. 100% agree with you. I mean, like, my memories of Columbine are very much people freaking out about Marilyn Manson. We now know that Marilyn Manson is a terrible person, but at the time it was like, maybe this is being a bit exaggerated. But Columbine and concurrently Morne Harmse, because as you say, so much of the coverage about him emphasized the satanic connection. They're both paradigmatic examples of how focusing on the paraphernalia of a crime can completely distract us from trying to understand the real causes of that crime. The fact that those boys wore those clothes and listened to that music did not make them perform those acts of murder. A lot of people listened to that music and wore those clothes. There was already a predetermined moral panic around that subculture because it looked so scary and witchy. And, we've panicked about witchy scariness for generations. So that in itself was nothing new. But the fact that they chose that particular set of icons to signify their subculturiness and their we don't belongness just made it very easy for everyone to not have to think very carefully about the crime. I mean, kids who commit these kinds of acts of appalling violence, thank God these are not that common in South Africa, but obviously unbelievably common in the US, which seems to have zero interest in trying to regulate things in a way that they will stop happening. These are often children who, as you say, are dysfunctional, disaffected, angry, traumatized in multiple ways. When we look at satanic killers, we often find these kinds of stories. One of the stories that I looked at for a previous book of so-called Satanist crimes about two young women who were murdered in Germiston, I think it was, that they were murdered by young men who they knew. And a journalist colleague of mine actually managed to get into the prison to speak to these two young men and found out that, the one was an orphan. He was passed around from hand to hand, from house to house. He had no home. He had no affection growing up. He had no stability. He had no home. The other was a child of a violent alcoholic who frequently beat him. Both these young boys who were in their teens, both of them drank. They smoked whatever they could possibly smoke. There was generational issues with alcoholism and substance abuse in this very poor community where people had no chance of social mobility. But all the coverage of the murder just went on about Satanism because there were some black candles, or the girls who were killed were injured in a very particular way. There was zero interest in the way that these crimes were reported, in understanding the context and history and social background of the murderers. It was infinitely simpler to just go, they were possessed by the devil. And I think we see that trend in Columbine. We see that trend in discussions of Morne Harmse, the way that most of the coverage kind of skirted away from his family and the strange letter that his parents wrote and the weird history that he came from, this idea that he was small and therefore he got bullied and therefore he decided to go and kill a load of people with a sword. And that suggested he was possessed. None of this really makes sense. But we as a culture, our police, our media, we're not interested in thinking about it in a deeper and more critical way, because it's much easier, I think, for us to go, oh, we understand this. It's much easier to go, I understand why this terrible, scary thing happened. It's because the person was possessed by the devil. The person was evil. I just need to pray more and be more religious. And then that kind of threat and that kind of danger will not approach me. I will be protected. So it's a way of distancing ourselves from what would otherwise be a level of fear that is difficult to live with on a daily basis.
I had many conversations with journalists about Morne Harmse's case and why the Satanism angle was so heavily pushed. I wondered, in Nicky's research and experience, what she thinks is behind some journalists still continuing to push the Satanism angle at any given opportunity.
This is a tricky question because I don't want to start dissing journalists, AI, when everyone's losing their jobs. We have a fairly robust media establishment in this country, especially considering our circumstances, which I'm very, very grateful for, but it is massively under threat. So there is that, right? Margins are shrinking. People have less and less time to do actual investigation. There's very little money for people to go and do investigation. And I think that often leads journalists and editors to just go for the low-hanging fruit and make the easiest claim possible. So if the police are going to go and investigate a crime and say something about how it's satanic, I think the press is just going to follow. Unquestioningly, no one really has the time or the energy to go and do any deeper investigation. So there is that. I think a lot of the time it's actually police who make these claims initially. And, the police force in South Africa is very, very Christianized. There's a lot of religion among our police. And you can't stop people from being religious. No, why would you? But, we should be a little bit more thoughtful about how that comes into the workplace, especially in such a diverse society. So I do think a lot of it is about resources, capacity, capability, lack of energy, lack of time. In some instances, I think people do report satanic stuff because of clicks and views, because yes, it does get you more attention, and the media can inherently be sensationalist. This is the other side of its role as the third estate, keeping democracy, holding democracy to account. The other side, the flip side of that, is that it can just be also not necessarily very useful socially. But I also think, in this very, very Christianized country that we live in, with this multiple decades long history of collective investment in the idea of good and evil, I think some journalists believe this. I think this is what they think. I think this is what they say. And instead of interrogating whether their belief systems that define how they explain and think about crimes, like many police officers, I think some journalists just aren't very critical about their own belief systems. And if you're not pushed to critique your own belief systems, if you are in a society where people are going, yes, Christianity is the only possible truth and we all believe the same thing, even though, of course, we don't, because there are multiple iterations of Christianity, some of which are completely unrecognizable to each other. But if you are in a situation where people are saying Christianity is the thing that we all believe, why would you question it that carefully? And I think this is also, the state, the media, the police, state institutions should be much, much, much more careful about removing religion from public life in this way. I quote, I think, a couple of cases in the book where there have been murders that are defined as occult. And then you get politicians jumping on the bandwagon, getting really upset about the fact that this is happening and going, oh, we need to bring Bibles back to school. We need to exorcise this town. We need to pray more. It's like, no. We need evidence-based solutions and funding that is angled in the correct way. But because we are not so good at separating personal belief from public service, we end up with this assumption that, Jesus will come and save us.
In The Devil Made Me Do It, Nicky writes about the occult-related crimes unit, and it's been quite interesting to see how that unit has shape-shifted over the years. When I wrote about Morne Harms's case, that unit obviously played a very big role in the case, with Kobus Jonker even submitting evidence. And of course, that crime happened in 2008. And the unit was quite vocal and public around that time and before that. Then, when I wrote Sizzlers, which is about the massacre of 9 gay men in Sea Point in 2003, they popped up again. When the investigating officer told me a story about how he'd been on the scene and an occult-related crimes unit investigator had arrived, saying he wanted to check the scene for ritualistic activity. And he ended up finding this bucket of bloodied water in the house, which he soon told the IO was a clear sign of an occult connection with the crimes. The IO then explained, with as straight a face as he could muster, that the bucket had actually been used by the ballistics unit when they'd collected bullets to wash them off before bagging them. I must say that I was given the distinct impression when I started writing these books in 2022 that the occult-related crimes units had disbanded completely and no longer existed. But then they started popping up in other, more recent cases. Although they are very much more low-key now than they used to be, I wondered if Nicky had any insights into the evolution of the unit and what it looks like currently.
I actually don't. And I really wish I did. I'm very much a desk-bound writer. I do a lot of my research on the phone and online, and I am not an investigative journalist. And I really wish that a really good investigative journalist would take this on and go find out where the occult unit is, because we know that their practices still exist as a very standard part of SAP's practice. I think in the book I do quote one document that I managed to find. It was published long after the occult unit had allegedly been disbanded, and it's part of a training manual for police colleges, and it's got a couple of paragraphs in it for how to deal with occult crime, and it's got things for like advice for police for how to do things like managing tokoloshe attacks and possession, and I'm like, that is not the job of police officers. That is not the job of publicly paid individuals who are supposed to be trained to look after citizens and maintain public order. They are not supposed to be chasing down tokoloshes. If a tokolosh needs to be chased down, you get a tokolosh specialist, right? You don't get a police officer. Police officers should not be exorcising people. But all of these ideas that emerge without question from the occult unit of the Coercion era are still playing a role in how policing takes place in this country. I make jokes about it, but I genuinely think that's really problematic. What if a police officer encounters someone from a very, very different cultural background to theirs, undertaking some kind of cultural practice that to that person seems very normal, but to our theoretical Christian police officers steeped in a certain type of evangelical Christianity, steeped in a training that told them it is their job to chase down occult influences, and they then decide that what this person is doing is somehow in one way or another criminal. You know, people related to the occult unit have been saying since it started up, oh, we don't prosecute occult things because they're not really illegal. We prosecute the crimes associated with them. There's freedom of religion in this country. We just prosecute the crimes. But that's not what happens. What happens is that people who have non-normative belief systems and people who practice non-normative religions are violently, in some cases, persecuted by the police. And it's not appropriate. It's a waste of resources. And it doesn't actually help us do a damn thing about our insanely high rates of violent crime.
The last update I got about the occult unit was that they were focusing predominantly on assessing dangerous cults developing in South Africa, as well as muti murders. And while I do think all detectives should be trained to understand things like coercive control, sexual abuse and financial abuse that happens within cults, and also how to identify murders which have been staged as muti murders, I don't know that we really need an entire unit to do this.
No, I absolutely agree with you. There is no occult element to cults. You know, cults are about coercive control. They are about the charisma of the cult leader. They're not about whatever the cult leader uses to keep their followers in line, keep them under control. You know, and I talk about this in the book when I talk about the Krugersdorp murders. These were not occult murders. These were cult murders. It was very clearly took the structure of a cult. So why do we? Yes, of course, it's a good idea to have specialist police officers who are trained to deal with cult activity if cult activity is a problem in your country. And yes, we do have so-called muti murders, and these are an issue. But we also have murders that happen as a consequence of jealousy, right? Jealousy is a big cultural problem in South Africa, where certain people are seen to do better, and then other people will try and take them down a notch, and that leads to all kinds of other violence. We don't have specialist police officers trained in jealousy. We assume that normal police officers who are good at understanding why murder happens, at working out what the consequences and circumstances of a crime are, that these people can deal with murders that happen for all sorts of different reasons. So why do we need specially trained officers for muti murders when these are actually just killings? Of course, it is important to understand the motivations for crime. If we don't understand the motivations, we'll never be able to counteract crime in any meaningful way. But that does not mean that crimes undertaken for supposedly occult motivations or spiritual motivations are fundamentally different and need to be investigated and treated differently to any other kind of crime.
I've expressed this sentiment to Nicky in the past when we've spoken. Over the last 7 years of examining South African violent crime, I've continued to see themes in these crimes. It happens especially with minor offenders who claim to have been involved in the occult, but also very much with adults too. It seems that what is really behind it all is a search for power and control. And I don't know how much that resonates with what Nicky has found, but even in a non-occult related crime, there's always this element of power and control underpinning everything. So if we seek to find a solution, should we not rather be trying to figure out why these individuals feel so powerless and helping them with that instead, before the crimes are committed, before we even get close to that?
Absolutely, I totally agree. I think all crime, to some extent, specifically all violent crime that's premeditated at least, is about control. Domestic violence is very much about control. People who undertake criminal activity because they want to be richer and have a higher status, that's about a different form of power and control. That is very human. We're never going to get rid of it. But in the specific kind of instances that you're talking about, where young people perpetrate acts of astonishing violence that they don't even try to get away with, right? They're not even lying about the fact that they did this terrible thing. And we then go and interrogate what they've said and what they've said in court, what they've told police, what they've told mental health professionals. And they're saying things like, I did this ritual because I thought the ritual would give me power. There's absolutely something there that needs to be investigated. There's absolutely some way in which the lack of social mobility in our society, the helplessness that people feel, the enormous gap between rich and poor in this country, all of these things play into a sense of poverty. And I write about this as well. You're talking about kids in townships who grow up with very little, but they also grow up seeing the billboards where people have a lot. And they also grow up watching TV. And they also know what it is. They have a very, very clear idea of what it is to have a better and a different life, while also seeing that that better and different life is not available to them by any normal means. If you have a society as aggressively unequal as ours, it is not entirely surprising that people who are close to the bottom of the pecking order at some point are going to go, right, well, there's no way for me to do this properly. There's no way, there's no hope for me. So I'll just do it not properly. I'll do it in a bad way. I'll try and take a shortcut. I'll try and find any means I can to change my situation. And, I'm not suggesting here that we go so deep into the world of restorative justice that we never blame people for what they do. Everyone has a choice. Everyone has moral responsibility. But to take away the understanding of our deeply unequal society, to take away the understanding of the failures of the promises of 1994, and the entrenchment, particularly of Black poverty in this country, to say that that has nothing to do with crime and that crime is simply a case of people being possessed and people, going to the bad, people being evil, to say that, endemic, ongoing levels of generational alcoholism, which are also a consequence of our apartheid history, that these things do not have an impact on the way that people are capable of behaving and the fact that life is cheap in our country. It is short-sighted. It is willful blindness, and it is a collective refusal to really, really look at why we're in the situation that we are in.
The Devil Made Me Do It is not just a book about occult crime. It's a book about all the reasons South Africans seem insistent on focusing on such allegations in criminal acts, and perhaps why some of us have been indoctrinated to some extent to do so. It's a book that begs for critical thinking, for South Africans to arrive at a point where we can see beyond the flashy, alluring headlines and really apply our minds to the base causes of crime in our country. Dr. Nicky Falkof is doing incredibly important work. She has many other books and pieces of published work, and I highly recommend all of them. The Devil Made Me Do It is published by Penguin Publishers. It is available in all bookstores and online as an ebook. If this conversation has intrigued you, or you have more questions for Nicky, which I haven't asked, there will be 2 opportunities in May this year where you can chat with both of us. On the 15th of May at the Franschhoek Literary Festival, I will join Nicky Falkof, Sarah Jane McCullough King, and David Cornwell, the author of Hull of a Country, for our session called Ordinary Monsters. You can book tickets for that on the Franschhoek Literary Festival's website. And then, on the 23rd of May, I will join Nikki Julian Janssen, author of The Murder of Devonay Null, and Tara Penny of Hot FM at the Kingsmead Book Fair in Johannesburg. Tickets for that are also available on Kingsmead's website. I look forward to seeing all of you there. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Nicky Falkof, firstly, for all of the incredible work she does, and also for joining me on the podcast to discuss the book. Go get it. You will not be disappointed. Shout out to this week's Patreon and PayPal superstars. A huge thank you goes out to Mamba, Laura Ford, Lucas Matoage, Jean J, Renee Kutzer, Danielle Hubert, Sue Linda Hugo, Leanne de Klerk, Joseph Claassen, Tracy Holland, Neil, Joanne Burr, Dee, Zoe Orths, Sean Newman, Marisha, Renee Soons, Gianni Makuzazane, CBS, Nick Bilski, Elna Kuhn, Tar Cox, Jana, Melissa Jagged, Willie Steenkamp, Magda Brown, Connie Lombard, Laura Olivier, Natasha Fisser, Johanni Pretorius, and Angela Boyens for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much, everyone. Your support really does make a huge difference. For more victim-focused true crime content, please follow True Crime South Africa on the app you're using to listen right now. I also have another podcast you might like called I Lived Through This. Follow the podcasts on social media platforms for updates on new episodes and other crime-related stuff. If you'd like to support the podcast and grab some True Crime South Africa branded merch, listen up. TCSA has partnered with the SA Criminologist platform. And if you head over to their website now, you can stock up on a wide range of true crime-themed merch, including tumblers, stickers, pens, mugs, and so much more. And if you use the code TCSA at checkout, you'll get a site-wide discount of 10%. Check out the full range of true crime-themed merch at sacriminologist.co.za and support TCSA while grabbing some truly cool goodies for you or your partner in crime. I'll be back with another episode before you know it. Until then, thank you so much for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.